經濟嘅情況。外圍逆轉時間將會繼續拖累香港嘅出口表現。雖然內地嘅經濟會進一步改善，但係能唔能夠完全抵消先進經濟體經濟轉弱所帶嚟嘅影響，目前嚟講呢都未曾完全確定，都要睇下呢外圍經濟惡劣得幾快，同埋加息嘅速度會如何。對於部分企業而言呢，疫情已經對業務造成打擊，再加上全球嘅供應鏈同埋運輸物流呢都未完全暢通，持續加息意味住資金嘅成本呢會上升，會令到經營更加困難。此外，金融狀況趨緊，資產價格會比較波動，甚至會調整，亦都會影響我哋本地嘅消費嘅情緒同埋投資信心。香港嘅經濟基本面穩固，經常帳長期錄得盈餘，財政儲備亦都豐厚，外匯儲備龐大，絕對有能力係應對外來嘅任何衝擊。而且我哋嘅金融體系成熟穩健，能夠處理大量嘅資金進出。事實上，儘管美國過去幾個月大力度收緊呢一個貨幣政策，香港金融市場一直都係運作暢順有序，冇出現任何混亂嘅情況。睇下大家有啲咩問題？
而家就繼續加息，請問喺繼續加息嘅情況之下咧，會唔會擔心對香港嗰個銀行嘅壞帳啊，或者係樓市咧，都會有一個好大嘅衝擊咧？咁另外你都提到咧，就話外圍經濟可能咧都會有衰退嘅，咁擔唔擔心話香港同時都會有一個衰退嘅現象咧？
美國持續加息，咁咧就香港嘅利率無可避免咧都會喺聯繫匯率制度之下都會趨升。銀行嚟講咧，銀行嗰個流動性非常之穩健，流動充足率咧係158%，國際嘅要求只係100%啫，資本充足率咧係20%，國際嘅要求只係8%。壞帳嘅撥備率咧，喺到5月底嘅時候咧，大概係0.98%，其實係好低嘅。咁可以咁講，香港嘅銀行咧嘅經營咧係相對穩健，銀行體系咧係穩固嘅。所以剛才提到美國加息對我哋銀行體系會否造成衝擊？對銀行嚟講，會唔會造成個別銀行嘅風險嘅情況呢？我哋覺得咧呢一個風險係非常之低嘅。第二咧就提到對我哋經濟嘅影響，剛才有介紹咧，就係下半年呢個外圍經濟環境會轉差，咁咧會影響咗內地對先進經濟體嘅出口，自然咧亦都影響我哋嘅出口，推動我哋經濟嘅增長咧係三頭馬車，出口、消費同埋投資。消費嗰方面呢，疫情如果能夠大致受控嘅話呢，我哋8月呢就有消費券推出，相信呢對消費會有一定嘅提振作用。而我哋參考舊年下半年嘅經驗，當個疫情受控，大家出返嚟消費，社會活動大部分恢復正常嘅時候呢，其實我哋恢復經濟動力個力度都係大嘅。總嘅嚟講呢，就下半年嘅經濟表現喺疫情平穩嘅情況之下呢，估計會好過上半年。全年嚟講呢，就政府經濟顧問都檢視緊一啲經濟數據，同埋評估緊個經濟前景。估計無可避免地呢，我哋全年個經濟增長呢會略為向下調整一下。呢一個呢，就等呢個評估完咗之後，大概8月中嘅時候呢，就會同大家公佈。
Mr. Chan, so now there are threats of global recession, and some analysts predict that Hong Kong Q2 GDP might see another contraction. So we're technically raising rates just at the wrong time. What's the impact of raising rates on the Hong Kong economy, and do you see the Hong Kong government having to downgrade your annual growth outlook? Thank you.
The increase in U.S. interest rate under the linked exchange rate system will impact on our interest rate. So over the past 2 months, you have seen the interbank interest rate has risen, although the prime rate remain intact. The rate of increase and the magnitude of increase in interest rate depends very much on the liquidity in the market and also the liquidity of individual banks. At the moment, we estimate that under the linked exchange rate system, when U.S. interest rate continue to hike, unavoidably, we have to increase the interest rate. But the pacing and the magnitude need not be on a lockstep basis. The impact of increase in interest rate on our economy is that with the increasing interest rate in the U.S. as well as many of the developed economies, the external economic situation will continue to worsen. So the export performance of Hong Kong will naturally be affected. But on the other hand, if the COVID situation is largely under control, private consumption with the launch of the second phase of the consumption voucher will have increased momentum in the second half of this year. So by and large, our assessment is that the economic performance of Hong Kong in the second half would be better than the first half. But taking the year as a whole, unavoidably we may need to revise our GDP forecast, growth forecast. At the moment, the government economist is examining various data and doing an assessment on the economic outlook. The details will be announced in the middle of August. As to the impact of the increase in interest rate on the property market, naturally with increased interest rate, the mortgage payment of homeowners will be increased. But we consider that the basics of our property market remain very sound. If I may share with you some figures. For new mortgages, on average, the loan-to-asset ratio is only 50-some%. And the repayment of individual homeowners, the amount of repayment as a percentage of their income, I mean the mortgage service payment, for new mortgages, usually average is about 37%. And when the banks grant mortgage loans, they have to do a stress test on the borrower. And under the stress test assumption, an increase in interest rate of 3% is assumed. And the borrower need to demonstrate his ability to withstand this stress test. The maximum mortgage service payment to income ratio is about 60%. So with all this, we think, although with the increase in interest rate, the repayment burden become a little heavier, but the staying power of homeowners and the ability to service mortgage remain very sound. Looking back over the past 6 months, with COVID, with the expectation of increasing interest rates, the property market remained pretty calm. In terms of price, residential properties overall in the past 6 months came down by about 3%. And the transaction volume came down about 10%. I think going forward with all the safeguard measures that I've mentioned and the strong underlying demand for home ownership, The basic of our property market remain resilient, although the sentiment would be dampened because of the increased mortgage payment and the expectation of the rate to go up further. Yeah, thank you.
係最後一題嚇，前面呢位女士。
Thank you. Can I ask about the recent financial woes of mainland property developers? Do you think that will further squeeze Hong Kong banks' funding positions? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, your question is about the borrowing of the mainland developers and the financial position of these borrowers impacting on the Hong Kong banking system, right? Do I have your question right? Yeah. We have been monitoring this situation very carefully, and we do not find cause for alarm. Basically, for the mainland developers, they borrow from our banks. They have to provide collaterals, and the bank have been adopting a very prudent lending policies with regard to all these mainland developers. As I mentioned earlier, looking at the liquidity position of the banking industry, which is looking at the capital adequacy of the banking sector, and looking at the classified loan ratio currently, we consider that the impact of the mainland developers' financial difficulty would have very limited and little impact on the banking stability of Hong Kong. Yeah.
OK， 多謝各位。
唔該。